It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Helen Reid. Helen is no stranger to schools, and she tells me she's been here in this room before. So Helen Reid was the headmistress of Warford Anglican Girls' School in Unley for some 19 years. Prior to that, she took a Master of Arts from the University of Edinburgh, a Diploma of Education from Oxford, and in more recent times, and I think since her retirement, a PhD in Education from the University of Adelaide. Her thesis involved a study of early girls' schools in Adelaide, and her book, which we have here this evening, deals with the study that she undertook, and her speech, The Age of Transition, South Australia's Private Girls' Schools, deals with the development of those schools, some of which were fairly amateurish in their early days by the sound of it, to those which moved forward to meet the needs of young women as the changes of society took place. I'm sorry, the microphone keeps falling down. The schools which Dr. Reid will deal with are Miss Thornburgh's School in Unley Park, Dryburgh House School in St Peters, Yoothamurra School at Glenelg, and Harwicke College in East Adelaide. Dr. Reid, I look forward to hearing of the development of education for girls in this state, and ask you to please come forward and speak to us.
The Age of Transition, a story of girls' education. And of course the first thing people say is, why girls' education? Well, I always thought it was a bit of a neglected field, rather neglected field in South Australia. We have two fairly eminent authors who have published works. Helen Jones touched on education in her book Nothing Seemed Impossible, and Alison McKinnon wrote about the advanced school for girls. But not much other work has been done, especially on private venture schools. I've always been fairly interested in women's affairs and the part played in South Australia by women in building up our nation. And it's particularly, I think, the place of women is particularly relevant in South Australia, because South Australia, as we all know, had many firsts. They were the first, Adelaide was the first university in Australia to accept women. Before, I may say, those people in the east, in Sydney and Melbourne, and with much greater open arms than at Oxford and Cambridge. And of course, South Australia was the first state to give women the vote, 1894, and they were in fact the second state in the world to give women a vote, but they were first to be able to send women as members of Parliament. I've always, of course, been interested in education, as I think David said. I've been in education in South Australia for 21 years. And I think as a fairly recent migrant to Australia, I came in 1971, you get a slightly different picture, perhaps, than you have other things to compare it with than if you perhaps live here. And I was always very surprised and very amazed that the young colony, 1836, grew to be such a sophisticated and forward-looking nation really so quickly. I mean, if you just consider it, we all know about Wakefield's plan, but it grew very quickly, really. When people came in 1836 and onwards, they came to new and uncharted lands in a very challenging climate. I come from Scotland, where there's a challenging climate, but it's not quite, I don't think, quite as challenging as this, where there was hot summers. Think of having your children out in the bush, 100 degrees or 40 degrees now, having children, no medical help, in huge high temperatures and not much sympathy, I think, probably from the men either. I mean, I think they had two terrible challenges, and they survived and built this wonderful city of Adelaide. It was a hard life. Who came, as we all know, they were mostly non-conformists, and they wanted really new structures, new ways of looking at things. But having wanted new things, they also brought familiar ideas, familiar institutions, family power structures. They brought their church affiliations and their Victorian ideals. Especially, I think, important to most of the early colonisers was the centrality of religion in their lives and the centrality of family life, the ideology for women domesticity, and one particularly important thing for women was the concept of the ideal woman, the homemaker, the man's helpmeet, the careful, frugal housekeeper, caring mother. Women, of course, were the moral influence in the domestic sphere, but not in public life. Women were the legal responsibility of men. First, a girl was the responsibility of her father, and then her husband. They had little personal autonomy, independence, but a set of well-defined and subordinate place in the structure of society. Girls were brought up to fulfill their ultimate end, to marry and continue the line. And they were also brought up to be charming additions to their husbands. It was very much in early days a shifting society. Families had to survive in the competitive and austere conditions. Those determined to better themselves nurtured the constant hope of improving their position in society. It was very much a shifting society, and improving their position in the stratum of society was in a constant flux, and the one thing they were keen on, especially for their children, as they wanted to improve their children's thing, was education. So we look at education really with the background of the society for which the young people were being educated. And from 1836, there was really little provision of education from the state, and especially little provision for girls' education. Education really became a private responsibility, and therefore the growth of private ventures. So we'll consider the boys' education. Boys had very much a practical education. Boys were being trained to get on in the public arena. There were some, of course, as we know, early foundations, St. Peter's College, Mr. Wynnham's School, Mr. Young's School, and in Prince Alfred College. The boys' schools had our university educating staff. They were rich, and they had custom-built schools. This, I believe, was the first school at PAC. I'd like to read from my book a little bit I wrote about the early education for boys' schools. Advertisements for boys' schools show that most offered a variety of practical subjects, as well as the usual elements of a sound, polite and classical education. For instance, under Reverend S.P.R. Allen in the 1850s, Riversdale Boarding School near Gummeraka offered classical, English and mathematical subjects, in addition to bookkeeping, land measuring and lectures with experiments in the natural sciences. Now it sounds very grand, Riversdale House Boarding School, but I found that Mr. Allen was actually a teacher at St. Peter's College, and there was indiscretion, and he left St. Peter's College under the cloud, and he started this Riversdale House Boarding School. The point being that he advertised this grand school, and it all sounds very sort of lofty and toffy, but in fact it probably was just probably opened his little house and he had grand ideas. You didn't have to reach any particular standards to put an advertisement. Anybody could. There were no relative standards. In the 1860s, many Adelaide boys' schools offered a curriculum which supported the development of rational logic. An extreme example was the Classical and Mathematical Academy, which taught, or said it taught, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, surveying, navigation, isometrical and other drawing, and the various branches of higher calculus with their application to dynamics, optics and hydrostatics, etc. So that's quite a mouthful with the Classical and Mathematical Academy. Probably in reality was probably about 40 boys, 30 boys, probably taught by people who were a little bit dicey on the isometric and other drawing and the higher calculus, but never mind, they put the advertisement in and they got some boys. In the 1870s, the Adelaide Education Institution, founded in Adelaide in 1856 and moved to Parkside in 1861, taught astronomy, chemistry, physics, economics and geology, in addition to Headmaster Young's own professional knowledge of surveying. Ambitious parents who could afford the considerable fees for this, what they called higher education, were giving their sons the advantage of practical, specialised knowledge which could lead to employment that commanded a higher salary return than might be expected from the frequently unreliable seasons on a small property. There was the added benefit of introduction to boys from families of similar enterprise and effective positive reinforcement of their aspirations for socio-economic advancement. So there we have it, the boys had very much a practical education for the world outside. What about girls? Girls had very much a domestic education in the domestic arena. And their education was mostly education, shall we say, of the emotions. A lot of art, probably copying, music, elocution, dress, personal presentation, upward social mobility. That's what they were looking for, upward social mobility via marriage. There's a little bit of unrelated knowledge taught, probably by rote learning. And what was taught was called the English curriculum, which consisted of reading, writing, elementary arithmetic, very elementary I should imagine, the globes, and the globe was a little bit of sort of a globe here and then the stars, and I think it was all a bit fanciful. A smattering of history, and the history would have been English history, a bit of Bible study, but music and art, those were what the girls were learning. Unrelated knowledge, not practical knowledge, knowledge for the domestic scene. And who taught? Well, widows mostly, was the one way that you could maintain your position in the middle class if you opened your house for a school. Not a school as we know it, just perhaps you had a bigger room and one or two of the youngsters next door came in, you probably had your own children and they called it a school. Then you wrote it up in the register as a rather fanciful way. Widows also had daughters, and often the daughters helped. Very much a domestic nature, and very often, if they were widows, in rented accommodation. And rented accommodation means that every so often maybe the landlord can seek at a slightly higher rent, so out you go, so that the schools were transitory. They didn't stay in a place like Prince Alfred's been here since 1869. 2 years in one thing, then perhaps down the road, and then over the other side of the street, and then probably in the same area because you've got your youngsters from that area, but not transitory schools. Small, 20 would have been large. Well, if you consider that they're just their houses, they're just domestic dwellings, 20 was a lot to put in a room. So 20 would be a larger school, and they were certainly inward looking. Where would they get the teachers? Well, teachers wouldn't need to know very much, probably just their daughters who'd learned what they'd learned. But they also had, these early girls' schools, had what they called visiting professors. Visiting professors these days sounds very grand. They've jetted away from Harvard or things. Not in those days. The visiting professor was the man down the street who knew a little bit more English or read a little bit more Shakespeare or knew a little bit more French than somebody else, and he called himself a visiting professor. So they had some men, but there was always a lady in the room, of course, if they were teaching. They weren't in it with a class of girls on their own. There was inordinate advertising. There was no check, because there were no trained teachers. The thing that really distinguished one school from another was the social standard, who went to the school and what social position they had and how they thought girls might improve their social position by going to certain schools. And the great thing was to produce the ideal woman, to produce one of these women who were going to have a good marriage and produce the line. There was quite a variety of girls' schools. They were clustered around the centre of population, a lot in the city. Practically every street in the city would have a school, if not one or two schools. They were, of course, in Unley and Mitcham, older areas, Norwood and Kensington, and when the train started, Glenelg and Brighton. They advertised in the Register and later in the Advertiser. The one thing that girls had, which probably boys didn't have quite so much of, was boarding. If you really wanted to make the money, you opened your house and you put your daughters in, squashed them together because their room could be for boarding. Quite a lot of girls came from the country and they would be sent at about 14, 15, not knowing very much, but having the company of other girls where they would get a slightly genteel education. They were more like as a finishing school. They'd meet other girls and I presume they hoped other boys somewhere along the line in the social scene, and they would get slightly wider, the girls would get a slightly wider appreciation of life perhaps than they would have on a property miles from Adelaide. And boarding cost a lot. One of the schools I found in the 1850s, 50 guineas a year. And when you think that a housemaid got perhaps £10 a year living in, and a governess, and there were quite a lot of governesses actually, they got £20 a year, so £50, 50 guineas a year, £50 a year to board was quite a lot. So I think somebody was making quite a lot out of the boarding. So it wouldn't have cost them £50 a year to have the food and to support some girls for a whole year. So these are the early years. I'm talking about the 1850s, 1860s. But the 1870s were a period of great change, aimed to produce efficient and intelligent citizens for the future. So they had stated curricula, the schools which the state built were custom built, and the classes were slightly bigger schools. Classes were graded by age and competence, and they had a rather more structured approach to learning. Also in 1876, there was training for effective teachers, was facilitated by the opening of the Teachers' Training College in Adelaide. And in some of these primary schools, certain of them, the slightly bigger ones, offered advanced classes, which laid the basis for the development of state secondary education. The first of these, which was actually a quasi-private school, it charged fees, 12 guineas a year, was the Advanced School for Girls, which opened in 1879, and it quickly grew in size, influence and academic prowess, and it provided great competition, as you can imagine, to these rather little trivial ladies' schools, as they were called. So we have one thing, the state education got a bit firmer and got a bit more of competition to these girls' schools. And the second milestone in the 1870s was the opening of the University of Adelaide, 1876. The university was aimed to provide a liberal and progressive education to the developing colony. It was envisaged as, in addition to the traditional areas of philosophy and the classics, mathematics and English language, new and practical areas of intellectual endeavour would be studied, and they envisaged classes in astronomy, botany, chemistry and anthropology. In Helen Jones' book, Nothing Seemed Impossible, she had a very good sentence, I thought. She said, "No particular discussion occurred on girls' education, and girls were admitted from the first without comment." So here we have Adelaide University, without comment, without any difficulty, accepting girls, certainly the first in Australia, and one of the first universities in the world to accept without comment, to accept quite happily girls. There was obviously a little bit of a thing behind that, because I actually researched the first class. There was a particular class for girls, the ladies' class, and it was set up from the start, from 1876. In its first year, it had 32 scholars. There were only 8 boys in taking university in the first year, but 32 girls. They were mostly daughters of prominent citizens, the Premier's daughter, a daughter of the Supreme Court judge, the President of the Legislative Council, the granddaughter of Bishop Short, who was actually the chairman of the university. So they're all fairly sort of prestigious people, but they were also, these people all had liberal and tolerant views, and the fathers wanted the university to be a success, so the girls went. You don't quite know if the girls went because they were being, kowtowing to their parents, or they were really interested, but they did quite well. First year some girls did very well. Dare I say, they beat the boys. But they weren't in the same classes, but in the classes they did together, 2 girls did classics, and they did rather better than the boys did. For 2 years there was this girls' class, and it slightly petered out because these girls didn't have any matriculation, so they were going just to do classes. They weren't going to get a university degree. They had to wait till they could matriculate before they got that. So this is a very different picture from the reluctant acceptance by Melbourne in 1881 and Sydney in 1883. Oxford and Cambridge universities accepted scholars on sufferance from the 1880s, but they withheld degrees until after the First and Second World Wars. So people at Cambridge couldn't get a degree until after the Second World War. They would get a degree, but they weren't fully recognised with their degree. And of course that was because once you got a degree, you were part of the government of the university, and they weren't going to have women as part of the government. but I don't think Adelaide had thought that through quite so carefully, and they certainly accepted women and gave them degrees, virtually gave them degrees from the start. Adelaide is certainly different. So these two not unrelated factors, the strengthening of the state education and the opportunity for university study, were vital in changing the nature of girls' education. Astute headmistresses understood the changing circumstances and increased competition in the state education, and accordingly they started to steer their schools along very different pathways. Successful schools became rather larger, with distinct teaching groups. The curriculum was widened, more maths, some elementary science, very elementary I would suggest, more rigorous language teaching, and increased number of visiting professors. The curriculum became more logical and planned. In 1878, the university initiated graded entrance exams, and originally they took the fellows had to sit the Melbourne matriculation exams, but in 1878, 2 years after the start of the university, they had exams here set by the university and marked by the university, and they had different levels. Higher and senior, it meant you could graduate and get into university, but they realised not everyone could straight away go and do those, so they also had a junior level. They had various compulsory subjects. Successful senior and higher passes gave matriculation and university entrance. Initially, of course, the girls' schools were only able to offer junior teaching. However, in the first exam, this is 1878, the girls gained more first-class passes than the boys. I mean, you consider they had not trained teachers, and they hadn't got rid of the thrust that the boys always had, and the boys knew they could go to university and get a degree, but the girls did better than the boys. Now, there may be reasons for this. We know now that, of course, girls mature physically much more quickly than boys, and therefore they mature intellectually as well more quickly. And the boys are so intent knocking the footballs around and playing the tennis late at night that they're probably putting some of their energy into that, whereas the girls, perhaps only the girls who were going to pass were put in by their schools, but certainly about 20 candidates, and some of those girls did extremely well. So those first trailblazers proved that girls' intellectual potential was certainly not inferior to the boys. However, they were disadvantaged by the range of curriculum open to them. They still had the art subjects much more in the fore, and very little science really, because they didn't have any labs. Not that the boys had many labs, but they started at Saints, they started in 1860 to have to set a room aside just for science, and I think from the start at PSC they set rooms aside, and they had some idea of having a specialist room for science. The girls, of course, had specialist rooms, but they were music rooms. I don't think there were too many music rooms at either Saints or PSC. So the successful schools gradually adapted this more rigorous academic approach, but they still had to maintain gentility. That was the important thing. They still had their music and their art and their proprieties, but on top of that, they put academic endeavour. So I've got 4 schools for you to discuss, one of which was really the sister school of Prince Alfred College, it might be called Harwicke College, and it was founded by one Mrs. Shuttleworth, who was the sister of George Cotton. And George Cotton was one of the founders of Prince Alfred College. And the Cottons had come to South Australia in the 60s, and she was Mrs. Shuttleworth at that stage, and she had 8 children, about par for the course, I think. And she had a husband who sort of did jobs here and there. He was on the property, he was out on the farm somewhere, and he went over to the gold fields, so they must come out in the 50s. He went over to the gold fields and didn't get nuggets, and he did this and that, and he was a little bit feckless, and she had sons to educate, daughters to educate, and she wanted the sons to come to Prince Alfred College, and nothing much was happening. So how was she going to be able to afford to send them? She was going to start a school. So in 1873, in a 12-room house just opposite the Kent Town Uniting Church, just over on, I suppose, the continuation of Fullerton Road now. She started up a school. And 12 rooms, so there were 2 or 3 for the family, and not very many other rooms, and she had boarders. So don't know where they all went, but she certainly had quite a I think only in a rented house. She didn't own the house, but she was able to build on a schoolroom, quite a substantial schoolroom, and the school grew. And this was just at the change when the state education was getting better and the university was offering exams. And she had early successes in the exam in 1878. 2 of her students got very good successes in the junior exam, and she must have found some good teachers, because by 1882 she had the 4th girl to matriculate in the state who went on to university. So she had some early success. Now, we don't know what sort of education Mrs. Shuttleworth had. Probably not inconsiderable. George Cotton was quite a mover and shaker. He was quite a middle-class Methodist family. Probably would have had some education. She may have had, but I couldn't find any real details about her. But she certainly had early academic success. She also had early music success. She was keen on the music, and they used to have music soirees in the assembly rooms. I think they were in King William Street. The public and grand people used to go to them. They were all written up in the paper, but no names of girls were ever mentioned, because you didn't push your name forward if you were a girl. The fellows could push their names, but not the girls. And they used to charge for these, and the money used to go for good causes, because that's one thing she had, was a great social conscience, and the young girls had to do a lot of work for those less fortunate themselves. So Mrs. Shuttleworth ran Hardwicke for 10 years. After about 7 years, she had rather a bad year, because 2 of her children died. They died of TB. And you can imagine they had boarders. She wouldn't want that to go around, would she? She wouldn't want to have other people's children, her children dying. And it just was a big, what a worry for her. And she wasn't very fit. Whether she also had a bit of the TB as well, I wasn't sure. And she actually retired after 10 years of her school in 1882. And she sold the business, and she was able to retire and live with the slightly feckless husband for quite a time. She was able to retire, and she sold the business to the Tilley family. Now, the Tilley family had come out from Britain about 2 years before, and Mr. Tilley had worked in schools in Britain, and he had 2 daughters, Miss Lucy, who by this time was 26, and Miss Florence, who was 24, and they were the first 2 trained teachers to come out. She had some training, a Cambridge certificate, and so they were trained teachers, and they took over the school, which had quite a good reputation and quite a few good students, and they took over the school. But Miss Lucy dreamed of a more prestigious education enterprise. Building on the already distinguished reputation of the school, she planned for a college, similar to those she knew in England, which would match the prestigious boys' foundations, where she could control the reins. With his specialised experience of schools in England, Mr. Tilley helped to design a new building, the first private girls' school in Adelaide to be specifically built for educational purposes. It had to maintain a domestic nature, yet forge a path of efficiency, incorporating up-to-date ideas on specialist teaching rooms, high ceilings, light, air and flexibility. Set in pleasant leafy surroundings of the established area of East Adelaide, with virgin blocks nearby for future development by families who might use the school, East Adelaide was subdivided into St. Peter's from 1877, and the school's address was at 6 3rd Avenue, St. Peter's. A local Glen Osmond hard bluestone was chosen for the building, with red brick quoins and other dressings. Special attention was given to ventilation, and the walls were of sufficient thickness to moderate extremes of temperature. The 2-storey building was cleverly designed to incorporate teaching on the ground floor with 3 large schoolrooms, which could be thrown open to make a 70-foot long concert area. in addition to 6 individual adjoining music rooms. At a later stage, some of the upstairs bedrooms were altered to make a large stage performance area. On the outside of the building was an enclosed grass play area with ample additional recreation space, garden, domestic livestock, and stables beyond. Sleeping accommodations for boarders and the Tilley family were above, in 20 bedrooms, augmented by additional balcony accommodation. There were bathrooms with deep drainage and a tower with a flag which announced that the Tilleys were in residence. The building gave the impression of permanence, taste and distinction, qualities which were soon reflected in the daily round of the prestigious First Girls' Collegiate Institution of the colony. Its cost was £4,000, so the necessary bank loan made it essential that all members of the Tilley family call on their reserves of self-confidence and industry to ensure the success of the enterprise. So this first collegiate school of the colony went very well. They achieved a good academic standard and they sent people to university with both the junior exam and the senior exams. They were particularly strong in music because Miss Florence took a degree from music from the university and she was a good pianist and she and a lot of other tutors taught music. In fact, it was the girls' school for music in the colony. It was quite forward-looking though. Miss Tilley used to bring in visiting speakers and she had a museum where they used to display all sorts of interesting things, and she taught secretarial subjects and she taught cooking to the boarders. She had an idea of something being practical with the idea perhaps that girls could, if they had to, get a job after when they left school. She was keen on sport. Can you imagine a girls' school with sport? They had a tennis court. I mean, it wasn't tennis as we know it. It was a little bit of hair and the long dresses and a little bit of pattern things, but they had tennis. In fact, she had competitive tennis. She had to give a little prize for things which was unusual. And I was most amused that she had cricket, because there was somebody called Clem Hill, who apparently is an Australian cricketer, I don't know, but he was South Australian cricket. His sister went to then, he used to bring a team, and of course all the girls used to hang over the fence, look at the boys, you can imagine. Hasn't changed much, I tell you. She maintained the school's social conscience, and most of their performances, music performances and choir performances were for money, so she could send the money to various good causes. And they particularly they had a Methodist school in India, and they particularly I found letters which from the Indian school thanking them for their small contribution. So the school went on till 1910, but it gradually, I think they reached their height, and then the Mrs. Tilley were getting on to be sort of in their 60s, perhaps a little bit dowdy, not quite keeping in touch with things, not quite developing their curriculum and things. And I was always a bit surprised it didn't become MLC, because Methodist Ladies' College, the Methodist school, was founded in 1902, but I don't think the Methodist Church ever thought they might transform that school and jazz it up and make it the big school. They went to the other side of town and had a completely different foundation. So it was quite interesting. I think probably the school was just slightly coming down here, slightly declined, didn't quite keep up with the times, and the school actually closed in 1910 when the Tilleys would be about 60, I suppose. But they of course owned their house, so they didn't have to move. Usually when the school had to be sold, or else the people had to, they couldn't afford to live in it, so they actually stayed in the house, and apparently got a little bit dowdy, It is now, if you know 3rd Avenue, it's a very spacious and gracious house. It is now the Lithuanian Catholics who have it. So I've actually been round the house, and they took it over, I think, in about 1960, and they certainly have restored it to its former glory, and it's rather splendid. They closed their school, but they had a very prominent old scholars group. In fact, the old scholars group used to meet and talk about, remember their school days, probably much better than they ever were. They always remember them a little bit more grandly than they ever were. And they used to meet until 1976, which isn't so long ago. So they kept on going for a long time. And the Old Scholars Group gave a prize, the Harwicke Prize. It is still given at university, still given for biology at university. So it still has certainly had a great history, and certainly was in its time a very fine school. We now come on to that was a Methodist school. We now come on to the Unley Park School. We come on to Mrs. Thornbur's school. Mrs. Thornbur was an interesting person. She came out in 1838 with 6 children. They always had 6 children, or 8 children, or 10 children. And she lived for her first 3 months on the tent in Glenelg on the beach. Yes, and Robert, her husband, had come earlier, and he was doing the usual wheeling and dealing, buying the land and selling it for more, and buying more and selling it and so forth. He was into sort of all sorts of business activities, I think. They moved to Mitcham, a house in Mitcham, in about 1950. They were keen Anglicans. The 2 boys were numbers 7 and 9 on the first roll at St Peter's College, and he gave his £25 as a founder of St Peter's College, and things seemed to be ticking along quite nicely. He must have been a bit overstretched or something, but he apparently in 1855 rather, he took laudanum. He committed suicide in front of the Mrs. It was all written up in the paper. They used to love those writing up of how it was all done, and the policeman came and this was said. So Mr. Thornbur committed the suicide. They always had these hopeless husbands. It's just a shame. It's quite presumably that's why they had a school, but they had some hopeless husbands. Mr. Thornbur committed suicide. She had a little girl, a 4-year-old, and all these other children, mouths to feed. There was no state subvention. There was nothing she could fall back on. So what was she going to do? She opened a school, and she had a little house in Mitcham, and she had the children next door. She had a daughter who had been a governess, was governing some other children. So she opened a school. She had some land in Unley, and she then built a 4-roomed house in Unley Park. And the street is now called Thornbur Street in Unley Park as recognition of her. So she built this 4-roomed house and moved it all down there. And 2 years after that, in 1857, she advertised for boarders. 4-roomed house, her own family. She advertised for boarders. But she did build on a couple of rooms, and she built a schoolroom. But that little school started quite nice. She was educating her own children. She got 1 or 2 people, 1 or 2 visiting professors from other schools. And it must have been quite good because it got some passes into university. And little Helen, little 4-year-old, which is why she'd opened the school, went to the Teachers' Training College. First year it opened. And there she met quite a few of the other people who were trained to be teachers. And because she got a teacher's training, she went to the Advanced School for Girls. And she was there for 3 years. I think she hoped to become head, and she wasn't made head when the founder left. So I think she then went back to her own mother's school. So she was really the kingpin of the mother's school, and she knew some graduates. So she was quite clever. She went back. She knew about the advanced school. She knew about more exams the girls should have taken. She knew about a slightly bigger school, and she encouraged her mother to increase her school. And she had one Miss Houchin, and Miss Houchin was a graduate BSc, and she pulled in the sciences. They were very good at biology and geology. And biology, when you think about it, you roam in the hills and get a few plants and you have a few animals. You don't actually need advanced labs. And geology, a few stones and a lot of bookwork. And she had excellent results in biology and geology. She also had a skeleton. One of the granddaughters of one of the things said, Granny used to talk about the skeleton. And this was terribly grand in the 1880s to give an actual skeleton there and point out the bones and things. But she said the skeleton was behind a curtain, just in case, it was improprieties behind the curtain. So they ran a very good school with good academic results and sent people to universities.
In fact, they even offered a university scholarship. But Mrs. Thornber also had gracious living, a nice house, and great, beautiful gardens. She wanted high standards of behaviour and great social awareness. She had boarders, and she got quite a few boarders, so she built bigger, brighter and better, a tower. They always had to have a tower. They had a tower and quite a nice, and bathrooms. They were the big things, running water, deep drainage, that was important. That pulled them in. Mothers were always terrified of getting the illnesses, but deep drainage was the thing. She had very high specialisation in science, and she used to send people. She went back to Britain, home as they always called it. She went back to Britain and found that the Frobel education, the kindergarten was all the buzz. So she came back and she, in the 1890s, early 1890s, opened a kindergarten. And in 1902, who should come to the kindergarten but Howard Florey. As we all know, Howard Florey was a Nobel Prize winner in the end. He didn't actually, get all his education at Mrs. Thornber's, but he started his first 2 years with Mrs. Thornber. So from somebody who started her life in South Australia in a tent at Glenelg, and one of the things down the line was somebody who, a great benefactor to humanity. It's rather lovely. It's a rather lovely story. So she had a kindergarten and quite little boys as well as little girls in the kindergarten. She had quite a social conscience. She gave a lot. The girls always had to give money to good causes, and they knitted things for the social service, and they gave things. And if they had a swear box, if they had sixpence in the thing, if you had the swearing, she and her daughter. She died in 1892, but the daughters kept it on, kept the school on, and they certainly gave a good education for the times. I'd like to read you a little bit about the her Rhodes scholars. Many of her Rhodes scholars married and raised families, not a few overseas. Two examples of the latter were Mabel Haslam, who became Mrs. Home of Ceylon, and Olive Haslam, who became Mrs. Richardson of Rangoon. But some remained unmarried, maintaining their independence by forging self-reliant lives with paid employment outside the home in the manners of the Mrs. Thornber. The obituary notice of Miss Thornber in the Register in 1924 furnishes details of the work taken up by former pupils. Continuing the nurturing tradition of women, two particular areas of paid work which were sought by young women of their class were teaching and nursing. As larger schools developed, Unley Park women rose to responsible positions. A group became headmistresses. The Mrs. Henderson, with their widowed mothers, opened the successful Portunga School in Harrow Road, St. Peter's in 1905. The Mrs. Fleming, Dorothy and Winifred, started it and conducted the highly successful Hopetoun Preparatory School. After the demise of Tormore in 1920, Vice Principal Hilda Tucker started the Angaston Girls' Grammar School, and Dorothy Poole, M.A., was headmistress of Wahronga Church of England Girls' School, Abbotsleigh, in New South Wales. The Burgess sisters also had notable careers in education. Fanny de Meaux had 6 successful years at Tormore before spending time in Paris and establishing her own Institute of French in Adelaide. Irene Lewis was awarded a first-class honours degree in physiology in 1907 and worked at Walford, then under the Dalton Plan at a progressive school in Wales. Lois Allen, B.A., taught English and French at a modern school in England. The fast-developing nursing profession attracted enterprising pupils. Phoebe Wheaton nursed at the Wakefield Hospital, where Tottie Lawrence was matron. Olive Furco was a senior nurse at the Adelaide Hospital, and Mary Shannon was a nursing sister with the Australian Army at Salonika in World War I. Both Ambrose sisters devoted their lives to missionary work in India. Lily as a nurse, Ethel as a doctor. Hilda Florey also became a doctor and practiced in Melbourne when widowed with 2 children to support. Others achieved eminence in diverse fields. Torella Quinn was the author of The Gum Tree Brownie and the Desert Rose, Nora Whitington and Bertha Tucker had careers in the Bank of Adelaide, and Muriel Bruce qualified as a landscape gardener in England. This wide range of positions, which were successfully filled by Unley Park girls, is testimony, I believe, to the achievement of the school. The Mrs. Thornburgh gave up the school in 1906 and retired, and it was taken over by the veritable Miss Jacob at Tormore, but she ran the school down and it closed in 1910. So there was Mrs. Thornburgh's school, quite a beacon of a school in Unley Park, producing very well-rounded and well-balanced girls who were able to go out into the world. The next school I'm going to talk about is Dryburgh House. Dryburgh House is an interesting school. It was founded by the widow of the Reverend William Harcus, and Harcus wrote South Australia, its history and resources and productions, which was probably the first yearbook. He was a congregational minister and editor of the Advertiser. He had 6 children. The oldest was Eliza. She was only 5'10½", but she was quite a character, I think. She married when she was about 19 in Adelaide, had a child, and went over back to Britain with her English husband. She had 3 babies, but he, yet again, dare I say, took to the drink, I think anyway, she left him. So as a Victorian lady on her own, she left him and she came back to Australia by boat, and the 4th child was born on the boat south of the line. So she arrives back in 1875. She was aged in her middle 20s. She arrives back in Adelaide, having left her husband, which was not a social thing one did in those days, I think. She was artistic, and she was fond of story writing. Because she was artistic, she taught at the advanced school for girls, and I suspect the Harkers is wondering how they're going to support this girl with then 4 children. They only lived in a smallish house, actually on North Terrace. So they had rented a house in Palm Place, just near St. Peter's, and I think they were going to open a school there. But 3 weeks before, Reverend Harkers died, quite, dare we say, unexpectedly. So Mrs. Harkers, what was she going to do? Well, she was a widow, but she opened the school, presumably in deep mourning. So she moved to Palm Place and she started the school. Palm Place was quite a good, quite a good place. It was a nice house for the family. It had a bit of a garden, and it was quite a suitable area, because there was St. Peter's just over the wall, and St. Peter's boys were there, and they had sisters. And so she was going to make the sort of school the sisters might come to. So she was trying to attract, I think that's, we say, clientele. And they ran quite a good little school, primary school, and then it grew up and it became for older girls, and did quite well, did a few exams and so forth. And in 1884 they bought the school next door. There was another little school, similar school next door, and Mrs. Kelsey took over. That's what she liked. She knew what she was about, Mrs. Kelsey. The first thing she did was change its name, so it went from Mrs. Harkis's to Mrs. Kelsey's to Dryburgh House. Now Dryburgh was associated with Sir Walter Scott, and Sir Walter Scott was very much the novelist of the time. She admired Sir Walter Scott, and Dryburgh House, quite a nice ring about it. She thought that was just going to be the thing. So she followed the academic line. She also had good music, and she was very keen on deportment, elocution. She actually specialised in art because she was quite an artist, and she got quite a few artistic family. She got the Glynn family. He was a High Court judge, and she had Marjorie Church. Marjorie Church actually married the Gwynn brother, and she has Marjorie Gwynn has at least 3 pictures in the art gallery. I don't know if you saw the recent exhibition of women things. She had 2 pictures there. And the Ashton family, he was the art master here, quite a famous art family. So she seemed to have attracted artistic families. They thought a lot of her art, I think. She sent her girls to a cookery at the School of Mines, and she was obviously had ideas that girls should be trained. She was thinking of what was going to happen to the girls, so maids and things weren't so easy to get, so she sent them to cookery, which was fairly unusual. And she also sent her daughter back to Europe. She sent her daughter to learn piano with Clara Schumann in Leipzig. And the daughter came back, and she came back to teach music, and she was able to charge 12 guineas a year for music lessons. So she worked out that if she had a good training, she'd be able to think if anything happened, she'd be able to look after herself. She upheld the proprieties very much, did Mrs. Kelsey, as befitted St. Peter's families, and the upwardly mobile and the prosperous. And I just want to read you a little bit about some of her old scholars, because she certainly did put the arts very much in the way, but she had an artistic bent, but she brought out the best in girls. She brought out their whole potentiality. The lasting impression of education in the humanities was also demonstrated in the later lives of other pupils. Dora Bryant, a Broken Hill boarder, recalled that at Dryburgh she had learnt to love poetry, art and music. She learnt the piano and violin, accomplishments which she continued on returning home to look after her 6 younger siblings on her mother's early death. Later she married an engineer and had an adventurous life in New Guinea. As one of the only 2 white women in a mining community, she taught reading and manners to native children along with her own family. She attributed her wide interest during her 90 years of life to the spur she had received during Adelaide's school days. Classmate Ita Gwynn, daughter of a well-established legal family, recalled with clarity the artistic stimulus which she had received during her Dryburgh years. A devoutly religious woman of strong personality, she became a generous worker for charity. Her contribution throughout her life to church work, especially in sewing beautiful vestments, was largely attributed to Mrs. Kelsey's powerful influence to encourage truth and beauty. Mrs. Kelsey would have been delighted that her aim of developing inborn characteristics and faculties was realised in such different ways. Joanna Priest recalled that her mother, Moo Jeffries, was fortunate at Dryburgh to have a deep appreciation of the arts from Mrs. Kelsey, who was a great inspiration to her, and therefore thereby to Priest and generations of dancers in South Australia. Mrs. Kelsey, in her 50s, wasn't very well, and she sold the school in 1906, and she sold the school in its entirety to a Mr. Coghill. So here was a girls' school being sold to a Mr. Coghill, which was unusual, should we say. Now, Mr. Coghill had Mrs. Coghill, and I think she thought Mrs. Coghill would do it, and they also had a child. So I think maybe she thought it was all right to have a fella, but as long as there's a wife and a child. And Mr. Coghill was quite a stout Presbyterian. So the school changed, and Mr. Coghill, from Victoria, where they had great ideas of efficiency, he majored in an efficient school. So he changed its character, changed its nature, didn't quite get the beat of the people who had traditionally gone to Mrs. Kelsey's. And after 3 years, he moved to a grander area. He moved to 3rd Avenue, St. Peter's. And there they had, dare we say, a flag and a tower, and the governor opening it, this new Presbyterian school. And they called it a Presbyterian school. They called it Presbyterian Ladies' College. It was quite out of the blue. I mean, I don't think he just announced at speech day he was going to be they're going to be moving. It was going to be called Presbyterian School, and the Presbyterian Church had 3 people who were on a like a council. So he no longer had real control. The Presbyterian Church had control. So they really attracted new clientele, and I don't think he quite got the idea. I think maybe when moving to 3rd Avenue, St Peter's, they rather overstretched themselves, and the school slightly went downhill. I suspect they put so much money into buying the new property, there wasn't quite enough to sort of keep the day-to-day running going. Although Mrs Coghill did her best, he actually went back into the education, because he was a trained teacher. He went back into the education department, and then the war was looming, and things didn't go very well. The school was closed in 1914, probably because of the war, and there was a drought in 1914, and he didn't quite gauge the clientele, the new clientele. So Dryburgh, having been very much a school for artistic children and a school for the arts, really went downhill a bit at the end, and the Presbyterian Church, shall we say, got their fingers slightly burnt. Didn't really, and they backed it, but they hadn't backed it. I suspect they'd backed it morally, but they hadn't given any money to it, and so they then got their forces going in 1922, and then started a really well-planned school, and that's what we know as PGC. But this was actually probably the forerunner, but not a very happy and successful forerunner of it. If I ever talk about it, PGC said they knew nothing about it. No, they hadn't even heard of it. But it was in its time. Dryburgh was a very successful school, I think, and I think Mrs Kelsey, I think she did a very good job. So the last school I'm going to talk about, if you're still with me, is a school down at the beach called Yoothamurra. It was down at Glen Elg, and Glen Elg, as we know, was an attractive seaside resort, and it was linked by the train for commuters, so there was quite a good, shall we call, middle class clientele there. And now we meet Mrs Kingston, and Mrs Kingston was married to a half-brother of the Premier, and the half-brother of the Premier was a lawyer, and he wasn't at home. He'd left home, and he was practising somewhere up, and then he was practising up in Port Augusta, and then he was no more. I think he took his own life. So I think he was a reasonable disaster. But he left Mrs Kingston in the home in Glen Elg with 2 children. So what was she going to do? Open a school. It was about the only thing these ladies had. The only thing they could do was to open a school. And she must have had a few ideas, but she opened a school in the family house in Bristol Street. And she had a friend, Miss Dow, who came from the country near Borough. She and Miss Dow together really ran the school. She rented the place next door, and then she bought the place next door, and she built a substantial schoolroom between them. And she soon had quite a flourishing primary school of about 90 children. Mary Dow had actually herself been to a school in nearby, actually run by Mrs Kingston's mother, and she'd had experience with younger children. But their school grew to about 19, and was soon able to offer university exams at the junior level, very basic academic subjects, and also music and art. But she had quite a clever thing then. There were 1 or 2 graduates coming around, and she engaged one Miss Trey, who was a BSc, and she taught maths very successfully, so that they had some academic success. Mrs Kingston was actually the brother of Mr Stanton, and he was the Director General, and I suspect he gave us some tips and ideas and so forth. So the school was shaping well. They took some boarders, and I think Miss Dow looked after the boarders, and then they took some boarders, so they need to expand a bit, so they bought the next door house. So they then had 3 houses, just ordinary domestic dwellings. Then it all goes off the map a bit. There was no longer being advertised, and I wondered they couldn't find it, and I found it later on in newspapers, 1905. And when I questioned some old scholars who were It was the row. The big row. Apparently they had a row. There were two fairly determined, and yes, I think they were probably two women of character, and two women being in charge of a school, maybe one didn't know which one. There were troubles, I think, so they had the row and the school broke into two. So it sounds chronic. Two of the buildings, there was Mrs. Kingston, and she had the younger children, and she actually taught music. She was quite musical. And then in the other house, there was Miss Dow, and she had boarders. So they ran the schools side by side, a little bit hazy. I couldn't find any speech day reports or advertisements, things, a bit hazy at that stage. But in 1908, Miss Dow took the older girls, the boarders. She rented a grand house in Pier Street called Caira, and she really must have concentrated, I think, on boarders. She concentrated on boarders with all the pretensions of boarding, but not a very academic curriculum, I think. The idea was to get girls from the country, and she came from Borough, so she presumably had a few friends and so forth there. They sent daughters down for a little bit of finishing, shall we say, and the niceties of gracious living. It was a very gracious house. But I don't think Miss Dow really sort of kept up very academically. I think she realised that she had to get some staff, and she had some quite reasonable staff, and she had one or two gifted students. Faith Crumpton was there, Faith Crumpton, who was university, and she hated it, apparently. Hated Miss Dow, the headmistress. She used to have, that was quite a good story, she told me this herself, she used to open all the letters, and so Miss Hope Crumpton realised that, and she wrote in French, and of course Miss Dow had no French, so that was quite good. Anyway, she left. She obviously had some parents who wanted a bit of an academic thing. There were some reasonable things, but I don't think she had no real grasp of what academic life was all about. And I certainly think the school suffered during the war, and she don't think she really gauged the fact that women, after the war especially, were getting jobs. Young girls were getting jobs from other schools,